Got it.
All right. I think we're in business. Can everyone see the source sheet?
No.
Can you make it a little bigger?
I can make it bigger. Is that better?
Yes. Yes.
That's right, Joshua.
All right, let me just make sure
Is it?
everyone who's here.
Ah, okay. Where is the, yes.
All right, Parshat Pinchas. How's everybody doing?
Okay, thank you.
Fine. Hi.
So I wanted tonight look at something sort of just an idea theme that kind of emerges from probably the most famous incident in the Parsha. And it's more of an idea. I'm not sure that everything is a perfect connection, but I hope that you'll agree with me that there is a thematic connection with what we're going to do. And at the very least, I hope it'll give us a chance to look at some interesting collection of sources. So Pinchas, Parshat Pinchas actually picks up in the middle of the story from the end of last week's Parsha, where we have the, we'll call it the incident in Shittim with the Moabite women. So you'll remember last week, Bilam had been hired to curse Bnei Israel. And every time he attempts to curse them, he's not successful. God changes his curses into blessings. So seeing that they're not able to spiritually cause any harm to Bnei Israel, according to the rabbis, it's Bilam himself. In the Torah, it's not quite as clear, but they hire these Moabite women to come and prostitute themselves with Bnei Israel. And it seems that it wasn't merely prostitution, but there was some religious significance, that somehow there was an element of idolatry involved, whether it's because the women were wearing idolatrous necklaces or other jewelry, or that somehow in the act of being together that was a form of worship. But there was not, it was not only sexual morality, but there was some idolatry involved as well as it's understood. So that's at the very end of last week's Parsha. And the Parsha ends by telling us, I'm going to pick up in verse number 6. Hine ish mi bnei Yisrael ba, vayakrev el echav et hamidyanit le'nei Moshe le'nei kol adat bnei Yisrael, v'hem abochim petach ohamoed. An Israelite man came and he took in front of all his brethren a Midianite woman, and in front of Moshe and the entire congregation of Israel, and they were crying at the opening of the tent of meeting. Vayar Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, vayaka mitoch ha'eda, vayakach romach biyado. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon the Kohen saw, and he rose up from among the congregation, and he took a spear or a javelin in his hand. Vayavo achar ish Yisrael el hakuba, vayitkor et shnehem, et ish Yisrael vet haisha el kubata, v'teyater megafa me'al b'nei Israel, and he arose and he stabbed this Jewish man, and in the same action, the spear went through and stabbed the woman as well. And this stopped the plague that had erupted in the camp. 24,000 people died in this plague, in this punishment, what they did with the Moabite women. And now picking up at the beginning of Parshat Pinchas, Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen, Yeshiv et Chamati me'al b'nei Yisrael, v'kano et kinati b'tocham, v'lochliti et b'nei Yisrael b'kinati. God speaks to Moshe saying, Pinchas ben the son of Elazar, but the son of Aaron the Kohen, turn back or return, put back my anger from against Bnei Israel when he was zealous for me. And I did not wind up destroying Bnei Israel, the Israelites, with my zealotry. Therefore say that I am going to give to him my covenant of peace. And it will be for him and for his children after him a covenant of eternal priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and he atoned for Bnei Israel. Shem Ish Yisrael Hamukeh Asher Ukat Midianit Zimri ben Salu Nasi Beit Av Shimoni. The man of the Israelite who was killed here by Pinchas was Zimri ben Salu, who was the Nasi, the chief of the tribe of Shimon. Shem Aisha Hamukah Midianit Kozbi Batsor Roshimot Beit Av Midyanhu. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Kozbi Batsor, who Sor was one of the heads, the chiefs of the Midianite nation.
Question,
Yeah,
are they Midianites or Moabites? I thought,
yeah, it goes back and forth. That's why there's some confusion about who exactly hired them and where exactly they came from. But Midian and Moab are often treated in sort of the same breath. But it's a good question. Any other questions or reactions to this very provocative story?
Why were the women not targeted by the plot?
That's a good question. I've never seen it discussed. I mean, we could sort of make our own guesses. Generally Jewish women are considered more chaste, more pious. There certainly seem to be some elements of, prostitution, men with women, that was part of this religious cult. I don't know the details of it, but why, the assumption that men are easier to entice than women, I'm not sure exactly. It's an interesting question.
But it's a curious, strange thing. A lot of social regulations and criticisms in many societies are directed at women. The skirt isn't long enough, or it's a skirt and not a floor to ceiling curtain. There's makeup. There's inappropriate makeup. There's a wig that looks so good that it is better than a human person's head of hair, and it's odd. It's strange as to the attitudes that are around.
It's a much deeper question, and we can talk about it at some point. But the general explanation for all these restrictions is that rules of modesty are to kind of, because the assumption is men have a hard time controlling themselves. So why the onus gets placed on women to not entice in any way is a really interesting question, but that's the general assumption. I don't want to get much more into it tonight, but it's a good question, and there's certainly what to say about it.
But they didn't like the brand of beer they were drinking.
Yeah. All right. So Rashi quotes a really fascinating Gemara. Let's just go straight to the Gemara, source number 3. The Gemara begins actually with the Mishnah on the page before. That's what source number 3 is. Hagone vet hakisva, v'hamikalo bekosem, v'haboel aramit, kanaim pogimbo. So someone who steals a kisva, we're not going to even try to explain that at this point, or someone who curses through the means of a sorcerer or other divination, and one who has sexual relations with an Aramites, with an Aramean woman, Kanayim Pogimbo. Zealots can strike such a person. Okay, that's what we care about in the Mishnah. So we have this halacha Kanayim Pogimbo, and the assumption is that this is what was applied to Pinchas, right? Remember, the Torah told us Bikan Oed Kinati, when he was zealous for me. So this is right, whatever Boel Aramit, and why it says our Aramean, and clearly in our Parsha it wasn't Aramean, it was Midian or Moab. So they all get lumped together in the same category, but the halacha is Kanayim Pogim Bo. Now we come to this fascinating Gemara. And someone will tell me when I need to scroll down to the next page in the English. Rabbi Chisda, Haba limlech ein morin lo. Rabbi Chisda says that if someone asks, right? If someone asks what the halacha is in such a situation, we don't instruct them to do it. We don't tell them what to do. Itmar nami, Amar Rabba Barchan, Amar Yochanan, Haba limlech ein morin lo. So we have another tradition that also says that if someone asks what to do in this situation, we don't tell them that zealots can strike. Below ode, Ella she'im pirish zimri v'hargo Pinchas neherag alav. If in the moment when Pinchas rose and stabs Zimri, if Zimri had separated from the woman he was with, from Cosby, and Pinchas killed him when they were not together, then Pinchas would be put to capital death, capital punishment. Nehepach Zimri v'hargo lePinchas ein neherag alav. Or if Zimri turned around and he killed Pinchas, Zimri would not be punished for killing Pinchas. Shahari Rodefu, because Pinchas was a Rodef. Pinchas was a pursuer. He was out to get Zimri. And Zimri, someone who's pursued is allowed to defend themselves and not be held accountable. So now the Gemara continues to tell us a little bit more background of what was happening. Vayomer Moshe al Shoftei Yisrael. So Moshe said to the judges of Israel, they have to go out and stop all the Jewish men who were sinning. Halach shifto shel Shimon etzel Zimri ben Salu. Amrulo heindan indine nefashot v'atay yoshev v'shotei. So the tribe of Shimon goes to their leader Zimri. They say, look, everyone else is dealing with meting out capital punishment. Moshe told the people to go and kill all those who are sinning, and you're just sitting here quietly. Ma'asa, so what does Zimri do in response to being challenged by his tribe? Amad v'kibetz kaftalid elef misrael v'halach etzel Cosby. So he gathers 24,000 Jews, whether this is only from his tribe of Shimon or from other tribes as well, not clear. And he goes to Cosby, one of these Midianite women or Moabite women. Amarlo hashmi ili, and he says, be with me. Amralo bat melachani v'chen tzivali avi lo tishmei ela legadol shebahem. She says, I come from, my father's a king. I come from royalty, and I was instructed I can only be with one of the great leaders of the Jewish people. I can't be with a regular guy. Amarla af hu nasi shevethu. So he says, well, you're in luck because I happen to be the leader of my tribe. I also have a position of leadership and authority. Below od ela shehu gadol mimenu shehu sheni lebeten v'hu shlishi lebeten. Okay, so v'tafsa b'boy, he says, I'm even better than, I'm a higher status than your father because I was born, I was the second born to my mother. He was the third born. So he grabs Cosby and he brings her in front of Moshe. Amarlo ben Amram zo asura umuteret. Says to him, Ben Amram, right? Interesting way to call Moshe, son of Amram. Is this woman prohibited or permitted? V'im tomar asura, if you'll say that she's forbidden, but yitro mihi tira lecha. Who said, why were you allowed to marry the daughter of Yitro, who was a Midianite, right? Yitro was a Midian priest. Moshe married his daughter. Nit'alma mimenu halacha. The halacha, the ruling, the law in this situation disappeared from Moshe. He didn't know what the ruling was. Ga'u kulam bivchiyah. And the entire nation starts to cry. Moshe doesn't know what the halacha is. What are we going to do? I think I needed to scroll down in the English, right? And that's how the Gemara is reading that pasuk that we saw earlier, that they were crying at the opening of the tent. Not that Zimri and Cosby were crying, but the entire nation was crying because Moshe forgot the halacha. Vayar Pinchas ben Elazar. So then the Torah tells us Pinchas saw what was happening. Mara'a. What did he see? Amar Rav. Rav says, Ra'a ma'aseh v'niskar halacha. He saw the act that was taking place in front of him, and he remembered the halacha that Moshe had forgotten. Amarlo achi avi abba lochin liberatani beridachame har Sinai. So he says to him also another interesting way to refer to Moshe. Achi avi abi, the brother of my father's father, my uncle. But it's an interesting way of saying it. Well, didn't you teach us when you came down from Har Sinai? One who is having relations with a kutit, with a foreign woman, zealots can strike him. Amarlo, Moshe says to Pinchas, Kraina de igarta ihu lihave porvanaka. The one who remembers the teaching is the one who should be the agent to carry it out. It's a weird story, right?
He's surrendering the right of judgment to some guy who says, well, you don't remember a halacha. Why does Moshe not remember the halacha? He's in shock.
Okay.
And he's also a modest man. And he's wondering as well, whom did he ask for reshut to marry the woman that he married? He asked Yisro. Yisro said, fine. Is that enough?
Yeah. It's a really fascinating Gemara on many accounts.
But this, it's a very strange piece.
There's no idolatry involved with Moshe and the woman that he married. This is a different case. It doesn't apply.
Okay, it was before Matan Torah. Maybe she converted. We can think of a lot of ways to justify Moshe, but right. It's fascinating to see, though, that there was still this accusation hanging against him. We're now 40 years later. So that's fascinating. The Ran raises a really interesting basic question on this Gemara. This is not going to be our focus for tonight, but it's an interesting. Does anyone see a fundamental problem with the exchange between Pinchas and Moshe? How does the Gemara open? Haba limlach.
Oh, yeah. He shouldn't have said anything to him.
Haba limlach ein morin lo. If someone asks what to do, we don't tell them what to do. What happened at the end of the story? Pinchas says to Moshe, Moshe, isn't the halacha that someone's supposed to kill him? Right? So Moshe's response should have been, no. If you're asking, then it's already too late. Right? Even if Moshe forgot the halacha momentarily, once he remembers it, according to what the Gemara itself says, the response shouldn't be, oh, you're right, that's the halacha. You can have the reward, the zechut, the merit of carrying it out. His response should have been, no, you're too late. You ruined it. You missed the opportunity.
But this isn't in the Torah.
Say that again?
Rav's point is not in the Torah. There's no mention of Pinchas coming to consult with Moshe.
This is Torah Shebal Peh.
Right. This is the Torah Shebal Peh filling in the details of what happened.
Right.
It sounds like another accusation of Moshe being inadequate. If he remembered, he would have done what he needed to do. If he didn't remember and he's reminded and then he remembers, he should know what to do, but he doesn't do and permits it. Now, there is an idea of the king, the ruler, the monarch of a society having the power to order the death of basically anybody that he decides should not be alive. And what Moshe's doing here, in effect, if he's oriented to what's around, he agrees that Zimri needs to be killed.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he has that power, maybe, if he's considered a melech, then he has that power, and he does it in a delicate way by sort of a hint.
That's interesting. That's an interesting take on it. So maybe in the end, this was not an instance of the halacha of Kenai and Pogimba, but this was an instance of Dinei Melech. That's an interesting suggestion. I mean, that's not what the Gemara assumed. The Gemara assumes this was an instance of Kanai and Pogimbo. But you're saying, well, the only way maybe we could get around the Ran's question is if it's no longer Kanai and Pogimbo, that maybe Moshe was saying, oh, well, since fundamentally that should be the punishments, we can extend my, my status as king to meet it out. Interesting.
Maybe.
Okay, so the suggestion I heard, and I apologize, the Ran was not on the Safario website, so I couldn't get the text. But the Ran basically says that, and he picks it up, makes a diuk from the Rashi in source number 5. Rashi says, Kanayim Pogimbo. If we see this taking place, then zealots can strike him. B'nei Adam Ksherim. What is a zealot? It's a person who is kosher, who is fit, Hamitkanin Kinato Shamakom, who are zealous for God. The Ran says that the only way you can mete out this, you can realize this punishment of Kanayim Pogimbo is, it has to be in the moment. It has to be when you're so overcome with rage and with zealotry, zealousness for God. But it also has to be by someone who's kosher, right? Think about it. If there's someone who is prone towards bloodshed, towards violence, they might go and seek out instances when they can act as a zealot, right? I have this desire to act on my violent tendencies, so I'll go and I'll find cases where the halacha might justify it. The Ran said that would be an improper application. So when Pinchas comes to Moshe, according to this approach, and says, wasn't the halacha such and such, he wasn't saying, does that therefore mean I should kill him? But he was asking Moshe, am I the right person for this? Am I considered a kanai? Am I considered zealous in the right way that my acting out would be appropriate? That it wouldn't be some fulfillment of some latent desire that I didn't even know I had. And they point out that's why Pinchas is introduced as Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen. It's very abnormal for the Torah to go back 3 generations in giving someone's identification. Should have just been Pinchas ben Elazar. Why does it have to go back to his grandfather also? To show that just like Aaron had pure kavanah and was always righteous, Pinchas was righteous as well. Because that's just a parenthetical question the Ran asked, which I thought was a really interesting approach to this whole thing. But what I wanted to focus on for the rest of tonight is this idea that Pinchas turns to Moshe, right? There's this horrible sin taking place right in front of them. Pinchas turns to Moshe and he says, isn't the halacha such and such? Right? He needs that halachic justification before he's able to act. Putting aside the Ran we're taking as a parenthetical comment. But putting aside what the Ran said, according to this read in the Gemara, Pinchas only acts once he's told that that is indeed what the halacha says he should do. Which seems to be exactly counter to what the halacha in this case is. Kanayim Pogimbo, it's supposed to be done in a fit of rage and emotion and not based on intellectual learning. And so that's sort of the question I wanted to look at tonight is I called it sources of knowledge. Maybe it's sources of authority, basis for action. But what's going on here, right? Do we really have to always justify everything we do with the textual basis? Is there room for acting on one's emotions or intuition? Does it always have to be kind of grounded in the text? Everyone get the question?
Yeah.
So Pinchas was asking for a hechsher.
He was asking for a psak, yeah. And the halacha seems to be saying that this is not the time to ask for psak, right? Just like when Bnei Israel are stuck at the Red Sea. And right, there's the sea on one side, the Egyptian army on the other side, and Moshe cries out to God, and what does God say to him? Mati tzakelai, why are you screaming to me? Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yisau, speak to Bnei Yisrael, let them go in. This is not the time for prayer. This is the time for action. So that seems to be the case here as well. So that's what I wanted to kind of just look at a little bit tonight.
This is reminiscent in a strange way to the unfortunate, terrible events that happened in Texas, and
Yeah.
having, as of the reports that I've heard, that there were hundreds and hundreds of law enforcement people with weapons
Yeah,
present, and they did not act because they, in fact, were waiting for an order, a confirmation from somebody in charge in order to go in and do what might need to be done.
right.
And there are instances when it's time to act and to move forward.
Yeah, Yeah.
Good analogy.
yeah. So as another sort of parenthetical to transition into this, it's just interesting to note that the other probably well-known passage from our Parsha is the story of Benot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad. Right? So the situation there is there's this man, Tzlofchad, who has 5 daughters and no sons. And the halacha is that sons inherit from their fathers and not daughters. And so these 5 daughters go to Moshe and they say, our father didn't have any son. Why should our family lose out on our rightful inheritance in the land? And Moshe says to them, I'm in source number 6. Vayakrev Moshe mishpatan lifnei Hashem. Moshe brings their case before God. Rashi there quotes the Gemara that says that why does Moshe have to bring their case to God? Also, nit alma mimenu halacha. He forgot the halacha in this case as well. And then he goes on to tell us the reason Moshe forgot the halacha here is because he displayed some arrogance. Right, it's a little bit out of order as it appears in the Torah, but at the beginning of Sefer Devarim, he says when he was setting up the court system, whatever is difficult for you lower judges to rule upon, bring to me. And so he was showing arrogance that he's saying, I'm going to always have the answers. And so therefore he was punished here and forgot the halacha, at least temporarily. So that's another really interesting theme that runs through our parsha. But again, that was another sort of aside. And now let's get into some sources that deal with kind of this, what is our proper source of knowledge or of action? So the first example is a very provocative passage from the Gemara. The Daf Yomi just did this. For those who have been following my Daf Yomi exploits, Yevamot destroyed me, and I fell off the wagon big time with Yevamot, but we're now in Ketuvot, and I'm back on. And so far, 13 pages in, thankfully keeping up with it. Well, I know, it's going to be with an asterisk if I make it all the way to the end, because there's still going to be about 100 pages of Yevamot that are calling my name. But anyway, so there's this really troubling, provocative Gemara that I think brings this question to the forefront as well. The beginning of Ketuvot deals with, the Ketuvot, which spells out how much money is brought into the marriage contract for Betula, for a virgin, for a woman being married for the first time, and for a woman who's being married for a second time, right? Again, a little bit troubling for our day and age, but what if she claims that she's never been married, that she's a virgin, and then when they're together for the first time, the husband makes a claim that she's not a virgin, right? So what do we do in that situation? So that's what this Gemara is dealing with. So I think the English is displayed for you, and I'll read the Hebrew, the Aramaic. So there was a certain man, a groom, who came before Rabban Gamliel bar Rebbe, and he said to him, I was with my new wife, I slept with her, and I didn't find any blood, right? She wasn't, meaning that seems to be a sign that she wasn't a virgin. Amrale, Rebbe adayin betulani. She said to him, I'm still a virgin. Amar lehen, aviu li shtei shvachot, achat betula v'achat beula. So he says, bring 2 women into the court, one who we know is married, who's not married, who's a virgin, and one who is married and is no longer a virgin. Hiviu lo v'hoshivan al pi chavit shel yain. So they bring these two women into court. He has them sit on a barrel of wine. Be'ula recha notiv. Betula ein recha notiv. There is no scientific veracity to what he did here. But for the non-virgin, the smell of wine, passed through her body, and they were able to smell it on her breath.
Mm.
The virgin, the smell wasn't able to enter her body, and they did not smell it on her breath. So they took this woman, this bride, whose virgin status was in question. They sat her on the barrel, and there was no smell of wine, proof that she was in fact still a virgin. Amarlo, so he says, go be with your wife. There's no problem. So the Gemara says, well, if we know of this test, nivdok meikara. Why didn't he do this test beforehand? Why did you have to first, go through the whole trial and bring in the other women? Or you could even test before the marriage ceremony. Gemara hava shmiale umasa lo hava chazin. So he says that he had this as an oral teaching that this is an effective test, but he had never seen it play out. The savar dilma lo kam le begave demilta shapir. He said maybe it's bubamaisers. Maybe it's not really a valid test. Lav aral is yozule. Israel, and it wouldn't be proper to denigrate a Jewish woman without verifying that this was in fact an effective test. So when his hands were tied and there was no other way to verify, that's when he relied on it. So again, interestingly, because we normally think of the oral tradition being quite strong, but here it was Rabban Gamliel Bar Rebbe doesn't have full faith in the oral tradition, and he has to verify it for himself, and only when the situation is very dire. So that's that's one example where we see kind of, well, what is our ultimate source of authority? We generally think that the oral tradition you receive is of the utmost authority, but not always. I'm sure we can make all sorts of distinctions. Maybe when this is medical advice, but it's I thought it was a really interesting, and it was definitely fresh on my mind as I was putting this together.
So this means that, at least in regard to this, that there was a defect in the transmission of what was purported to be an oral tradition from Sinai, and that's what it is.
Well, it doesn't say there was a defect. It just says he didn't believe. He had his own doubts.
If you have a Rav who doesn't believe in Torah Misinai,
right, where it doesn't
or
say
a part
that
of Torah Misinai, doesn't that disqualify the Rav from being a judge?
Yes. So again, there's many ways that we could read this, and I think the most simple is to say this is not a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. This was some received oral tradition, right? Again, maybe not quite in the realm of halacha. It was a teaching that was circulating, but it wasn't necessarily going all the way back, and that's maybe how we could justify his doubting it. It doesn't say there was a flaw in the transmission, and it doesn't tell us explicitly. I don't want to raise aspersions against Rabban Gamliel. It doesn't say that this was halacha l'Moshe Misinai that he rejected, but it says that he didn't buy into this oral tradition.
But that means that there are differences in the quality of oral traditions.
Yeah, for sure. That there's different levels, different quality. Certainly, if it was halacha l'Moshe Misinai and he didn't believe it, that would be a problem. It raises interesting questions about what to do in a situation where, raises certainly in this case, this is a pretty extreme example of our science really debunking whatever the Gemara is telling us took place. Some might say that's the point, that he knew it wasn't going to work, and he wanted to preserve the dignity of this new bride. But it's an interesting Gemara. It was definitely on my mind. It's a story that it's hard to forget once you've heard it. The next story, equally as fascinating, very different context. And again, someone please tell me when the English has to scroll down. Amar Yehuda Amar Rav. Bishash and Niftar Moshe Rabbeinu Legan Eden, Amarlo Leoshua, Sha'ami Meni Kol Sveikot Yesh Lecha. When Moshe was about to die, he says to Yehoshua, who was going to take over as leader, ask me any questions that you have. Amarlo, Rebbe, Klum lo hinechticha sha'achat, v'alachti l'makom acher. Lo kach katavta bi, u'masharto Yeshua ben Nun, nar lo yamish mitocha ohel. So Joshua says to Moshe, I've never left your side. You yourself wrote about me that, right, way back in Sefer Shmot. Moshe's assistant, Moshe's servant Joshua, never left the tent. Miyad tasas kochol Yoshua v'nishkachachu mimenu shalosh meot halachot v'nodu lo sheva meot sveikot. So immediately, once Joshua says, I never left your side, I have no questions, of course, he forgets. He forgets 300 halachot, and he has 700 questions arise. Do Kol Yisrael lahargo. The entire Jewish people wants to kill him. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lomar lecha yefshar. God says to him, I can't tell you what the halachas are that you forgot, because these are now halacha l'Moshe Sinai, as Robert just quoted, and they're lo b'shamayim. It's no longer in heaven. It's no longer mine to tell you. So what should you do? Lech v'tordan b'milchama. Let the Jewish people go out and fight battle. They want to kill you, let them go against their enemies. They'll forget all about their gripes against you. Okay, interesting. So right after, the first thing they do in Sefer Yoshua is they go to war. The Mishnah says similarly that during the days of mourning for Moshe, all these different learnings and teachings were forgotten. Amar Rabbi Abahu, Afal Pikein Hechaziran Otniel ben Kenaz Mitoch Pilpula. Even though they were forgotten by Joshua, Otniel ben Kenaz was one of the Shoftim, was able to restore them through his pilpul, through his Talmudic exegesis. So we have this fascinating description of Joshua being punished for his arrogance, right? Saying, I don't forget anything. I never left your side. And in fact, as soon as he says that, he forgets a whole lot. And, but, there's comfort in the story because they're able to ultimately learn these same halachot out through the Talmudic exegetical principles. So there's much discussion about if they were able to learn it out, why was everyone so mad at Yehoshua?
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that? Well,
They didn't know that they could do that somebody could use logical analysis of sources and evaluate and so on and arrive at what must be true because it's in harmony with the whole body of evidence, the whole body of the Torah, the way the Torah is. It has to be true because it fits.
okay, beautiful.
And otherwise, other things would not make sense.
Right,
So
okay.
it must be true.
So that's a beautiful explanation that, they didn't know that there was another way to get there. They thought the only way was through the oral received tradition. And so maybe if Otniel had spoken up earlier, they would not have been so mad at Yehoshua. Any other thoughts on that? So a different explanation says that they were so mad because even if they did know that it could be restored, it's not the same qualitative law, right? Something that is received and passed on as a direct transmission of the Masorah directly from Hashem at Har Sinai is qualitatively better than something that is reconstructed. And so they were mad at Yehoshua for losing that Masorah. Even if the end of the day, the practice becomes the same, even if you're acting in the same way at the end of the day, if your source for why you're doing it is not the received tradition from Har Sinai, so that's a bidiyah, that's less than ideal, or that's less special, we could say. And so they were mad at Yehoshua for losing that element of it.
Well, a psychological explanation may be that they were projecting their anger towards Hashem for taking Moshe away from them and putting it on Yehoshua.
Okay, that's true. Or right, just pointing out that
Oh,
Yoshua
they're
was
not, I don't know, because it
clearly not at the same level as Moshe, so they're angry. Yeah, that's very possible. That's very possible as well. Any other thoughts on this Gemara from Tamura?
Rabbi Yehuda Nasi edits the Mishnah, his Mishnah,
Mm-hmm.
and it's normative, but he left out a bunch of things, Brightot and so on. They're external. And yet, in order to arrive at what the halacha is in a variety of situations, the Rabbanim quoted in the Gemara frequently reach out to Mishnaic level external items that are not part of the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi,
Right.
but that are still remembered and say, if we look at this and we combine it with that and the other, it explains, it justifies, it proves. But that implies then that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi has in effect made a compromise as to what will be considered the main normative things. And it's a strange circumstance.
Well, yes, I mean, right, but on the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's entire project was a Horat Shah, right, Shara Dechak, because there was danger of things being forgotten. And if we, if you read the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah, so the reason why Gemara was ultimately developed and written down is because, just as there was the need because things were being forgotten in the days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, so things were being forgotten, right? In his generation, they didn't need to include all those Brightot because they had a working knowledge of it, right? The Mishnah was whatever was brought in the Mishnah kind of spurred their memory to bring all those other sources in. It's only when there was more forgetting and more dispersion and more suffering that they forgot those sources and had to bring them in more explicitly and recorded in the Gemara. So, but yeah, I mean, the entire writing down of Torah Shabbal Peh of the Mishnah is a fascinating subject, which is definitely connected to what we're talking about right now. So I want to move forward, and we'll just this next source, number 11, we discussed on Pesach in my Shabbos Hagadol Joshua. So I don't want to necessarily look at it inside, but if you remember, we spoke about the fascinating article, which if you haven't read, I still highly recommend, by Rabbi Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, Rupture and Reconstruction, the Transformation of Contemporary Orthodoxy, where he says that the major change in the post-Europe, post-Holocaust Jewish world is the shift from a mimetic tradition to a textual tradition, right? That the primary source of knowledge in pre-Holocaust Europe was the mimetic tradition. How did someone learn how to keep kosher? Because they saw what their mother did in the kitchen. That's how they learned to keep kosher. But once we had the loss of an authentic tradition due to the horrors of the Holocaust, we can no longer rely, he says, on the mimetic tradition. And that's why we have such a tremendous rise in the proliferation of halachic guidebooks. Why we have the rise and embracing of chumras, of stringencies, because the only authentic tradition is the textual tradition. Not to say that they didn't learn texts in Europe. Of course they did. Of course they put a lot of weight and significance in the texts. But the primary source of knowledge and of practice was the mimetic tradition. And he makes the claim that we no longer can rely on that mimetic tradition. And that's given rise to a more sort of rigid textual tradition where everything that we do has to be justified in the texts. And the reason why chumras, why stringencies have become so prevalent is because you want to try to be as loyal to that textual tradition as you can. So if you find even one obscure source that says, well, out of a doubt, maybe we should be even more stringent, that becomes sort of the norm and defining characteristic of Orthodoxy post-Holocaust. So again, this is just to kind of remind us of that fascinating discussion. Really wonderful article. It's a long article. It's really, even 25 years after it was written, it remains kind of a landmark and something that's really important. The next one I wanted to look at is a story from Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. I think I've shared this story before, but it really, again, drives home this kind of tension that we've been talking about. He's reflecting on when he moved to Israel, and he was living in Jerusalem. I was once walking with my family in the Beit Israel neighborhood where Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer used to live. For the most part, it consists of narrow alleys. We came to a corner and found a merchant stuck there with his car. The question came up as to how to help him. It was a clear case of pirika uteina, helping one unload or unload his burden. There were some youngsters there from the neighborhood who, judging by their looks, were probably 10 or 11 years old. They saw that this merchant was not wearing a kippah. So they began a whole pupil based on the Gemara and Pesachim about whether they should help him or not. They said if he walks around bareheaded, presumably he doesn't separate Trumot and Masrot, doesn't separate tithes. So he's suspect of eating and selling untithed produce. I wrote Rabbi Soloveitchik a letter at that time and told him of the incident. I ended with the comments. Children of that age from our camp would not have known the Gemara, but they would have helped him. My feeling was, why, Ribono Shalom, must this be our choice? Can't we find children who would have helped him and still know the Gemara? We have to choose? I hope not. I believe not. If forced to choose, however, I would have no doubts where my loyalties lie. I prefer that they know less Gemara, but help him. And this is Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, a Rosh Yeshiva, writing this. Right. So again, but it's really bringing into focus this question about, right, should we be putting primary focus on our instinct, on our intuition, or on our textual knowledge, and where should we be turning, or what, how should we be deciding how to act? And he makes a very strong argument here for intuition. Right, he writes elsewhere, and I know that we've discussed it in previous times. Right, he has another famous essay about does Jewish tradition recognize a what's the name of the article about natural morality? Right, does our sense of ethics and morals come only from Torah sources and halacha, or is there some universal sense of ethics and morals that we should buy into and we should be familiar with, even if it's not recorded in Torah? One more source I wanted to look at tonight. This is a good friend of mine. We were in Smicha together at Chovevei Torah, Alex Kay. He's now a professor at Brandeis University, and he wrote this fascinating book called The Invention of Jewish Theocracy, The Struggle for Legal Authority in Modern Israel. It's basically a biography of Herzog, but within it, his attempts and efforts to, Israel as a country still doesn't have a constitution. But as the country was in development, there was a great debate over how a constitution should be developed and how it should be written. They never could figure it out, which is why they still haven't written it. But there was, the religious camp was advocating very, very strongly that the constitution for the Jewish state should be based in Torah and halacha. So that's kind of the background and the overarching theme that he's exploring in this book. And within it, he tells of a fascinating piece of history that I thought really drives this home. The first paragraph is kind of setting the background for where we're going to go with it. But he says, and I think this is a beautiful description, law is not just a way of getting things done. It is also a way of understanding reality, shaping the categories through which we define ourselves. Law is a discourse through which identity, power, and social roles are negotiated. For groups who feel marginalized or threatened by a state's hegemonic authority, the law can become a battlefield on which struggles for identity are fought and power imbalances addressed. Law can produce a counter-hegemony that challenges dominant power structures and prevailing cultural assumptions. Thinking about law in this way allows us to see legal rhetoric from a different perspective. Legal rhetoric that appears ineffectual in practice may still be useful as a way of mounting resistance or shoring up identity. Now he gives an example of what he's talking about. Says in the Knesset in 1961, there was debate over the capacity and guardianship bill. The proposed bill concerned the legal guardianship of minors and contained a clause requiring all children to honor thy father and thy mother. A quotation from the book of Exodus. How you enforce that law, I don't know. One might expect the religious parties to have been in favor of this incorporation of religious law, one of the 10 commandments, no less, into an official, like that should be official law of the state. And yet, Rabbi Zerach or Haftig, then Minister for Religious Affairs, opposed the move. There are things for which no law is needed, he told the Knesset. Why repeat the 10 commandments and thus, if I may say so, reduce the level of this eternal precept to a matter of transient law? Haftig worried that including one of the 10 commandments in secular Israeli law would cheapen a divine command, presumably by implying that God's word is not sufficient authority without the endorsement of the Knesset. Fascinating. Okay.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I just it took me a while to make my way through the book, not because it was poorly written. I just was reading it in parallel with lots of other things. But once I had some time over the summer and just a couple of days, especially the second half, like the last 3 chapters really wowed me. I actually was just in touch with him to see if maybe we could bring him as a scholar in residence to our shul. But anyway, I thought this was a really fascinating example of what we're talking about, right? The source of authority and the source of law, right? If this gets again, it's the same end result. No one's saying that children shouldn't honor their parents. It's a question of what's the basis for saying that? Is the basis for saying that because it's now a law incorporated into a secular state, or because we take as given that it's in the Torah and that we don't need the words of Torah don't need any strengthening.
If somebody in Israel is upset by what appears to be dishonorable behavior towards the parents by a child, and that's a death penalty offense, and he goes ahead and acts on that, nobody else is doing anything, and proceeds to kill the child. Has he committed a sin? Or has he defended the honor of Torah law against a civil law that maybe doesn't agree with it?
I'm not sure your example is exactly the right example.
Well, flip side would be possibly if you're not going to adopt a law that demands that children be respectful towards their parents, then I guess you'd also be opposed to adopting a law that says thou shalt not kill. Anyone who kills another human being will be subject to a major penalty, whether it's imprisonment or death or something like that. It's a very strange thing. To disqualify.
Certainly in the state of Israel, you know, you cannot act based on halachic principles here. You know, you would be certainly punished by the state if you were to, you know, in the case of a road day or whatever, you know, try it on your own to mete out punishments without going through the court system. But it's a really fascinating question. So again, I think it was more inspired by the Parsha and the Gemara's discussion of Pinchas and what the backstory to his interchange with Moshe. I'm not sure it was a dot to dot, you know, one step leads to the next, but I thought it was a really interesting question to ponder. Certainly inspired by the Gemara discussing Pinchas about what is the proper source of knowledge or authority or practice. And I hope that these gave you some what to think about. I know that's for me some very provocative and fascinating sources. And are there any final questions or thoughts on anything?
Very interesting. Very good.
All right, so
Basic
next week,
question is whether we can go beyond the Torah in a way that our behavior is irrational, but based on a very strong sense of what we think Hashem really wants to be done in the situation. That the discussion in the
yeah,
Torah-
so that's a really interesting question, and that comes up in a lot of different realms, right? So what, we're seeing that play out nowadays, right now, with the discussion of abortion. And right, really interesting. We explored some of those sources over Shavuos, but questions about should we be enforcing halacha's view of things on a broader society? There's been a whole fascinating exchange in the blogosphere about that. It comes up in questions of spirituality, right? If being in shul and davening with a minyan doesn't move me, is it better to go and daven in the forest if I find that to be more spiritually satisfying? That comes up, with not the story of Nadav and Avihu is a good place to look into that theme, because they were punished, they die, but they're called God's holy ones. So they were doing something right, even if they were doing something wrong.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of really interesting ways in which, right, can we ever go beyond the halacha? One question is, can we go beyond what halacha requires? But then, what if is there any times to go counter to halacha? And that largely was one of the big critiques against Hasidut, against Hasidim. So there's a long history about that question. It's a fascinating topic. All right, we had a lot to think about tonight.
Rabbi, I have one procedural problem.
What's
Is
that?
that very, very often the raven color of Gwyn Rosen flashed up on the screen. That the square.
Yeah.
For no particular reason, it just flashed and went away. Like right now, it's up there.
Yes, that's right.
I think that's
It's just because they're commenting on what's happening in a.
yeah, I think it's it's showing their microphone is engaged.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Don't
All right, we solved one mystery tonight, if nothing else. All right, have a good night, everybody. I'll see
Thank
you.
you,
We'll
Rabbi.
see you on
That's
Night.
Shabbos.
Yeah.
Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.
Erev
So